Good morning. Moving on to Unit 4, Lesson 3. Now we're going to be focusing on the South. And in the South, what their economy looks like. Remember two important things. The word economy, right, means how does an area make money? How are they financially successful? Who benefits? Who doesn't benefit? Trade is also a part of this as well. The second thing, remember, we talked about the Northeast in lesson 2 and how they begin to industrialize, and you see the rise of textile mills and other factories. In Unit 4, Lesson 3, we'll be talking about the rise of cotton. And with that will also come the rise of slavery and slavery as labor in the South. So at the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to explain the importance of the cotton gin and how it led to a dependence on slavery in the South. You'll be able to explain the relationship between the North and the South in terms of cotton industrialization and slavery. And then lastly, we're going to describe and look at some of the slave experience and the attempts at slave revolts by Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. So Eli Whitney is actually a man who's local. He's from Westboro, Massachusetts, and he's going to play a significant part of the Industrial Revolution. He is going to have two major inventions that will increase industrialization nationwide. Firstly, will be this idea of interchangeable parts. He creates this idea that parts for a product should be made to a specific standard. All parts would be made the exact same. So before this, you would make a product and it would kind of all be made just in one felled swoop. So think of it as like a shirt or clothing, like you're making that one article by hand. The idea of interchangeable parts is that everything should be the same size, the same specifics. So if you say, have a car and you get a flat tire, you can just replace the tire because all tires are the same size. You don't have to go throw the whole car away and get a new car. So this was a really revolutionary idea in terms of industrialization. But the big one we'll be talking about today is the cotton gin. This is a machine that separates seeds from cotton. Remember, we've talked about what products or what resources were grown in the South, what major crops. Up to this point, it had really been tobacco and rice and indigo. Cotton wasn't really a popular thing because it was extremely difficult to clean. You would kind of pick cotton from a plant, and then the cotton itself would be filled with seeds. So you'd have to sit and by hand pick out these seeds. So if I'm somebody that owns hundreds of acres of land, that's very time consuming for my labor force, which obviously in the South was slaves, until Eli Whitney invents this. So if you see on the left, those cotton balls that were picked from the plants would be put in the cotton machine. And then he created this type of cylinder that almost had teeth like a comb, and you would spin the cotton over the teeth, taking the seeds out, which then would have clean cotton on the side. So for one person who picked cotton for a day, when they were cleaning it by hand, they could only clean about a pound of cotton a day. Now, all of a sudden, with the invention of the cotton gin, you can now pick up to 100 pounds for that one person in a day. This is revolutionary. But one of the things that is not so good of an effect is cotton becomes very profitable. This is happening about the exact same time as you have the rise of textile mills in the North. What do textile mills need? They need cotton. So every Southern plantation owner wants to now start to grow cotton production. Cotton will, as you're going to see on a later slide, become king. Every plantation owner knows the North and Britain, who also has textile mills, they both want cotton. So they're going to look to transfer all their plantations to cotton. But the more cotton that's grown, the more labor that's going to need. So what are Southerners going to want? More slaves. This is where we look at a total explosion of the amount of slaves living in the South. And the thing about history, I want us to kind of stop and pause here for a minute, is that history is not pretty. History is difficult, and this is kind of one of the difficult topics that as a country we need to talk about. Slavery was, in fact, a reality. And in 1790, on the top map that you look at here, there was slavery in almost all 13 of the original states. It also had somewhat expanded west into Kentucky and Tennessee. But by 1860, the North had outlawed the use of slavery. But you can see in the South how much of the population, right? 50% is what you see in the red, where an entire local population was slave. So you can see in these areas here, most of the people living in the South were enslaved, which means they did not have freedom. They did not have the ability to live their lives the way they wanted to. They belonged to a person. And that's really remarkable and something that we definitely will be looking over in this lesson today. So, slavery becomes referred to as the peculiar institution. So take a look at this image, and your question on your guided notes is what you see, how you understand this. So the caption says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So just pause for a minute and write what you think this means. Another significant and awful piece of being enslaved is people are inherently human beings. They want their freedom. So slaves would run away. Slaves would try to defy their masters. Slaves would purposely not work hard so that they almost in a non-violent, resistant way would resist the fact they were enslaved. And as a result of that, many slaves would be whipped. And that's kind of what we see in this image here, a slave that had been whipped potentially because of his attempts at running away, potentially because of, his lack of work ethic. It could be any and all of the above. So the Southern economy is completely based on farming, remember. Large plantations, they had fertile land, plenty of rain. The crops included, as I mentioned earlier, tobacco, sugarcane, and rice. But with the invention of the cotton gin, the most important crop is cotton, which was grown in the Cotton Belt. The Cotton Belt stretches from southern Carolina to Texas. The importance of this is the cotton industry grows as a result of the increased demand for raw cotton from textile mills in the North, and also Great Britain. If I'm growing something on my land, I'm going to want to make a lot of money for it. And you had buyers for it in the North. So the North was implicit in this slave economy as well. The North could say, we don't have slavery. We pay our laborers here. We pay our workers, but you are benefiting from the Southern slave economy by you buying cotton from a place that is, picked and maintained by slaves. So, what was the slave experience in the South like? By 1860, there are about 4 million slaves. The number had actually quadrupled, which means times four, since 1800. Many of these slaves, the slave trade, bringing slaves from outside of the United States, was actually illegal in 1808. It still goes on. People smuggle slaves in, but you also have the um, encouragement of slave masters, the people that own the slaves, to procreate, to have children. And then those children, as they grew up, they would be ripped apart from their families and sold as property. Slaves are seen as an investment for somebody. They were not seen as human beings. Slave auctions were frequently held. Families were often split up through this process. This horror finally receives attention, especially in the North, through a novel that's published in 1850 called Uncle Tom's Cabin by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that was intentional, the fact that these families were ripped apart. It was meant to be traumatizing. It was meant to keep people in their place. And this is kind of, again, the horrors that we need to see of slavery. And it's difficult, especially in today's day and age, for many of Black Americans to trace their ancestry, because once they get to a certain point, they don't have names, they don't have records, they don't have things that white people had tying to their families. So we're going to look a little more at that at the beginning of next week, kind of, the long-term effects of this, harsh reality of America. Um, Being a slave varied greatly based on what region you lived in and who your master was. They have no political rights. They can't vote. They have no civil rights. They can't sue in a court of law. In some areas, it was illegal for them to be able to read. It was illegal for them to be able to gather together to attend church. They were often beaten or flogged, as we saw in that image, by their masters. So, one of the things that often comes up when I teach this is, why didn't somebody do something about it? Why didn't they fight back? They did fight back. And we see this going all the way back to, the 1600s as slaves begin to be brought to the United States, where they do rise up against these horrendous things. And you can kind of see here in this image is an example of a slave revolt and a slave uprising. And two of those slave revolts, we see one with Denmark Vesey. Vesey had bought his freedom in 1800. He planned to have a slave revolt in South Carolina in 1822. Whispers, talks from plantation to plantation, he had thousands of slaves ready to do this revolt. His plan was to kill all of the white people in Charleston, South Carolina, and burn the city to the ground. His plan is unfortunately discovered, and he is hanged. Another example of a slave revolt is Nat Turner. He carries out a rebellion in August 1831. Over 70 slaves participated in the revolt, and they killed over 50 whites. Many of the rebellious slaves, including Turner himself, were hanged by the state of Virginia. So the significance of these revolts is it kind of becomes this fear. Remember, going back to that map, if you live in a place where over 50% of the population is slaves, they have the numbers. They are the majority. So white Southerners were in fear of these revolts forever. So these resulted in even tighter restrictions on slaves. Like I said, not being able to, attend church together, meet in groups together, read, write. They had curfews. They couldn't be married. The whites passed all of these extremely strict laws because they were so fearful of these revolts. So we'll look more at these revolts in your practice Edpuzzle for today. And as I said, next week, we're going to do a group activity a little bit on runaway slaves and the significance of that as well.